Good morning. This is for History 17A, and we are doing we're going over test one, all right, for the content, okay? So going right into it, right? A lot of this comes out of your argumentative assignments. Some questions come from the textbook. So for instance, right, um, recall the difficulties of discerning Native American history. We talked about a lack or a scarcity of primary sources from the Native Americans themselves. Yes, we have the round counts and the cave drawings, and we have in few cases in Latin America the famous codices, right? The books that they wrote, or the stelae written on the stone in hieroglyphic writing, but not so much in present day United States territory. All right. And then not to mention the chroniclers, the European chroniclers could not be trusted because they were inherently biased, right? Says academia that they couldn't help but be Euro or ethnocentric and seeing things only from their own point of view, looking at the Native Americans. So even if they had the best of intentions, they were very limited in their success. We also talked about let's see here. Cultural achievements. Remember that the Europeans imposed upon the Native Americans, and through modern anthropology, it still somewhat remains this European bias, right? Whereby they want to look and see if the Europeans have manipulated the environment, if they have engaged in forming a complex society of multiple classes, right? Particular like farming, right? Cultivating and becoming self-sufficient in their own urbanized areas. They want to see if they've engaged in mathematical and scientific development and technological development. They want to look in to see if they've looked into the arts, right? Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Have they written poetry and made music and created a culture of any sort, right? So you're looking at that as well. Artistic expression, the arts and sciences. They want to see if they have developed a monotheistic religion, which of course the Native Americans, they could not win on that one, right? And we've delved into that already. Then also, as far as common Native American traits that you find in the final number of that, you'll have it something from that as well on the test. So remember, it was namely with notions of property that they did not share by and large with Euro Americans and Europeans, and also right the religious tendencies, right? So polytheism, animism, shamanism, pantheism. We talked about all of that, right? So those are all examples of that number. Then also getting into the Spaniards, Spanish colonization, we talked about the Black Legend, the origin of that term, right? How by the Spaniards contended that Protestant English and Dutch writers were deliberately maligning them, right? Centuries later, contending that they were very inequitable in the society that they created in the Americas, that they were tyrannical, religiously zealous and intolerant, brutal, greedy for gold, exploitative, etc., etc. And the Spaniards contended that that is all a quote black legend, right? So that's all tied to the image of the Spanish by way of the black legend. We talked about also, and by and large, right, that the textbook and a couple of the numbers on your argumentative assignment somewhat adhere to that negative image. However, to give credit where credit may be due, we talked about a system of accountability that the Spaniards had through the juez de residencia, right, and the visitador, the visitor general, coming and putting a Spanish gentleman under house arrest and giving an opportunity for people to lay forth complaints about their abuse of power. So we talked about that. And also, right, you could make the argument in some sources that slavery for African Americans was a lesser evil in the Latin American urban areas. Their chances for manumission were not thwarted by law like they were overtly in English North America. All right. Also, the Spanish, right, what they contributed as far as, functional history. They brought, right, in understanding how things are the way they are now. The Spaniards brought, of course, the origins of Hispanic culture to this day, right? They brought notions of modern law as far as Germanic and Roman sources, right, coming through the medieval time period in the Visigothic age, etc. going way back into Spain itself. Also, of course, Christianity and monotheism, modern notions of private property and urban development have come from the Spaniards. So all of those have come from the Spaniards, right? Imposing that on the Native Americans. And notice I'm not doing conflict history there, putting blame or praise on anyone, but just it is how it is in functional history fashion. All right. The regions in which the Spanish came, they came to virtually every region of modern day United States, arguably, with the exception of the Northeast, like the New England states, New York, etc., on the eastern coast, the Atlantic coast. But you have, Cabrillo into California in 1540, Coronado up into the Southwest, all the way into arguably Kansas by 1540, De Soto claiming the Southeast. Okay. And so, at any rate, moving on, the Spanish jurists, the lawyers and law interpreters, and those who would try to engage in legal justification, right, of taking over Native Americans' lands. We talked about figures in that demographic like Las Casas. Remember, he was known, Bartolome de las Casas, as the protector of the Indios, of the indigenous. He depicted them, right? Remember the two simplistic depictions of the Native Americans by Spanish chroniclers, and that was that they were either innocent and childlike, right? They call it prelapsarian innocence, that they were like Adam and Eve before the fall, right? They didn't know the greed and all these different sins and shrewd characteristics of the Spaniards. That they were like innocent children, not yet having imbibed those characteristics and those institutions. And so they either depicted them condescendingly as like innocent children or as demonic savages, right? And Las Casas, of course, depicted them as the former and not the latter. Castillo, I don't know if I'd go so far as because it was a little bit more complex than that. But his book, right, La Historia Verdadera de la Conquista, the true history of the conquest, or the conquest of New Spain or Mexico, he makes it much more complex than that. And he depicts the Aztec in particular, right, as being very shrewd, very diplomatic, very capable of cruelty, injustice, duplicity, et cetera, right? So he's kind of a counter to Las Casas. Remember Sahagún, he was a priest who tried to almost anthropology type style, try to continue for progeny the Aztec writings and Aztec culture. But at the same time, right, he had the famous quote whereby the Native Americans were sacrificing children to their god, and they were literally weeping as they were doing such. And he writes and says it was not their fault, that they were blinded by the devil, and that the ignorance that they were living in, although it was not their fault and they were not to be punished in any way for it, neither were they to be allowed to sustain themselves in that darkness. So notice that even some of the most well-meaning defenders of the natives amongst the Spaniards, still by today's standards, ethnocentrically demanded, right, that they assimilate and they become Christian and more like the Spaniards. All right. Junipero Serra, to me, he was emblematic of the juxtaposition, right, of court history and hagiographies praising these benevolent, paternalistic Spanish missionaries, right, sacrificing for the indigenous, showing great paternalistic concern for them and their well-being, right? And we talked about that with the very argumentative thesis that the Spaniards didn't know any better for their time period, living in such a inundation by religion at that time. And then also, right, later conflict histories, Marxist histories that depict Junipero Serra and others, right, as the initiators of cultural genocide, of forcing the indigenous, the Native Americans, to kill their own culture, right? And so very much a very strong polarization or dichotomy between praise of the Spaniards and depicting them as awful, exploitative tyrants. Then let's see here, where else? So we pretty much have gone through number 14 so far. Which of the following was not mentioned let's see here. So and 15 actually. Remember also in particular, I subjectively, if a professor asked me to adhere to the Black Red Legend, right, do conflict history, right, uh, those who lost, victims with whom I want to elicit your sympathy, and exploitative, tyrannical, greedy, manipulative, awful winners, right? Who won socially, politically, and economically, but were villains in doing so, right? I subjectively, in present US territory, would depict New Mexico. That's just me. But as far as finding like the dirt, right? I feel like I could find it most easily and most one sidedly in New Mexico. So if you look up people like Don Juan de Oñate coming in right away, there's an interesting book called When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away by a gentleman named Gutierrez. A lot of dirt on the Spaniards, a lot of manipulation, a lot of ethnocentric tyranny over the Pueblo, the Navajo, and other tribes that they generically called Pueblo. So let's see here. Textbook questions, I'm not going to go over those. You could see the actual questions online. So just go right to your textbook if you would, okay? Then moving on to the Southern colonies. Remember, conflict history, right? Like Helen Roundtree are going to depict the ugly English imperialist depiction of the English, right? With starting with Jamestown. They came, they knew they were not going to be welcomed or wanted, and they came anyway. They sought their own advantage and an own enrichment, even at the expense of the Native Americans. So you find evidence of this very forbearing, very patient and meek Powhatan, right, in her book, whereby he could have wiped out this very pitiful, initially pitiful Jamestown at any moment he wanted to, and of course he chose not to, right? And oftentimes it's attributed to the same mistakes in these type of history books on behalf of the Native American leaders. That one, they didn't see, they didn't perceive the real threat that was there because the English looked so pitiful at first. Two, they saw the wrong enemies. They oftentimes coveted, for instance, a military alliance of some sort with the English so that they could take on their indigenous, their fellow Native American tribal enemies. So, like with Powhatan, right? It was the Monacan. With Massasoit up in the Massachusetts area, it was the Narragansett tribe. And so you find that common mistake in hindsight, right? Hindsight's 2020. Um, so let's see here. So people like Helen Roundtree, they engage in conflict history, eliciting our sympathy for the Powhatan and other tribes, right? Um, and and then, however, right, you also have those like David Price and his Love and Hate at Jamestown. And they do just the opposite, right? English court history. He praises John Smith and says that his sagacity, his pragmatic wisdom is what saved the English, right? And that the Native Americans were anything but meek sheep. And he finds evidence of a very imperialistic Powhatan, right, over other tribes. Very crafty and shrewd Powhatan. And that only instead of the aristocratic gentlemen, right, like Ratcliffe and others, right, that in Wingfield, that it was actually the commoner John Smith who had the sagacity to meet fire with fire, right? So at any rate, you have the juxtaposition of those historiographical interpretations and approaches to this history. Then you also have those who want to focus on agency, right? And remember, with agency, they look at, particularly after the civil rights movement, people of color and women, right? So they look at the indigenous, they look at African Americans, they look at women, and they say, you know what, we don't want them depicted in typical conflict history fashion as poor victims all the time. We want to show where they made decisions that mattered, where they helped manipulate history in a certain direction, right? Good or bad, to show that they had power and moral agency back then as well. So, of course, you look at lost opportunities for Native American tribal leaders, right? Where, like I said, where they could have wiped out English settlements and chose not to. You look at the help that they afforded the pitiful initial English settlements, especially with agricultural and food and trade and military alliances, right? You see evidence of that. You look at evidence of them even pushing the Euro-Americans around, like in French Louisiana, right, down on the lower Mississippi and upper for that reason, for that matter, with the Huron, for instance, whereby they were able to take advantage of a scarcity of men and resources amongst the French colonists, and they were able to dictate terms to them. Okay, so you have evidence of that. You also have that book Black Majority, initially in colonial South Carolina, where there was an acute need for African American labor, and the African American men took advantage of that acute need, right? And they began making demands, and they began receiving manumission, partial manumission, money to eventually buy their freedom, limited freedom with their terms of service, et cetera, right? So all those would be evidence of agency. Notice, however, I was at, what was absent in my argumentative work was the work of women. I plan to rectify that very soon. But notice for the test that was not mentioned in your argumentative assignment. And as you might guess, oftentimes it was along the lines of Black Majority book, whereby there was a desperate need for women, a scarcity of women, especially in the southern colonies. But that's not mentioned in the argumentative work, not yet. Okay. Then also we have moving on to slavery, the very subjective, highly argumentative point, right, was conveyed in the work that slavery was an economic decision more than it was a racist decision. Remember, that does not mean that I, as your instructor, adhere to that thesis, but I thought it was thought provoking. I threw it out there. So, of course, supporting evidence, I need you to know that from the work, right? And you could largely guess what that supporting evidence was going to be before you read it. Diminishing numbers and diminishing trust in white indentured servant labor, right, as an alternative, right? Really argumentatively in some works as the initial mode that was pursued at first, right? But how that arguably began to fall apart. You look at primary source, especially with the Spanish, with their debates, right, with Las Casas and others. You look at the developing reputation of African laborers as being hardy, physically hardy, right? And you know, some even go so far as tying it to the later theses about the sickle cell trait, etc., that the Africans from the Ivory Coast had developed an immunity to malaria and other similar diseases, and hence they did not die in droves like the indigenous did when the Spanish tried the repartimiento and the encomienda systems and using Native American slave labor. We also talked about diplomacy with Native American tribes. So all those are put into that thesis, right? But I hope you also read in there the counter argument and evidence, Ibram Kendi's book and other books, right, where you could find the history of primary source material from Muslim Arab writers, Portuguese writers, and others, right, going back at least to the medieval time period of forming stereotypes, essentialist stereotypes and stigmas on Africans. Okay, let's see here. And not to mention people being treated differently on account of the color of their skin early in colonial history. But that's not on the test, but I hope you remember that. John Punch, Antonio the Negro Johnson, etc. Let's see here. African slave conditions. You had one on there. So notice, right, in the argumentative handout, it goes against Fogle and Ingerman's thesis, right? That because they were expensive investments, they were treated well. The argumentative write-up tries to counter that with evidence that you could have likely anticipated. Primary source material about how awful they were treated, especially by the women, the white women of the plantations and homes. The evidence of their discontent, right? Evidence of them absconding, running away with stuff, rising in rebellion, those other types of things, right? That show clear evidence that they were not happy, that they were desperate to get out of their condition, right? The slave codes themselves were draconian, and the punishments toward African American slaves, and also extremely lenient toward the white masters and overseers and their treatment, harsh treatment of African slaves. You look at them excavating in the slave quarters and literally having evidence of malnutrition, of very heavy labor that did damage to their bone structure, as further evidence, right, of the maltreatment of slaves. And so then also French Louisiana in the argumentative handout, right, that it was fluid by accident. You need to remember that for the test. And so remember, right, that it was supposedly, according to the thesis on here, that it was not the intention of the French leaders to allow so many opportunities to marry whom they wanted, to engage in whatever economic trade they wanted, right? But arguably, as often is tied to scarcity of resources, scarcity of people, scarcity of soldiers and leaders, right? Imbalance of men and women. Those all led to somewhat, you know, arguably a somewhat acquiescence into the reality of things by the French leaders and just saying, fine, it is what it is. We'll trade with pirates. We'll disregard the mercantilist restrictions on trade, especially because we are desperate for goods. All right. Let's see here. Albion Seed. Remember that book, right? Remember we talked about the very interesting and somewhat simple thesis that whatever the demographic was that first effectively colonized a given area, they made as best they could the colony out in their own image. So at the risk of oversimplifying it, the gentry class arguably took over Virginia and Maryland in the South, and the bourgeoisie largely inhabited and took over the northeastern states. All right, with that dichotomy, that's oftentimes tied to maybe arguably simplistic arguments about the quote inevitability of the Civil War later on. Let's see here. Religious liberty. I took the subjective license to in the argumentative handout, right, to make a contrast, to depict people like Roger Williams of Rhode Island, right, and William Penn of Pennsylvania as being well-meaning and idealistic and very kind of pluralistic in their as the foundation of their decisions to allow religious toleration in their colonies. That by today's standards, we're more apt to be impressed by them, right, and their vision for a tolerant, pluralistic, diverse society. I contrasted that with the Dutch New Netherlands, right, and depicted it as merely a pragmatic decision, right, uh, largely as a desire for the Dutch West India Company to continue to make money. So they put up with people like the Black Turk, Anthony Van Sally, the Jewish community, the Quaker community, and these others, right, for whom there seems to be clear primary source evidence that a lot of the regular Dutch people, as well as the Dutch colonial leaders, especially people like Peter Stuyvesant, right, a somewhat tyrannical governor, of them being very intolerant toward those demographics. All right. Let's see here. We did court history of William Penn, right, of this meek leader who, because of his religious epiphany and conversion to Quaker Christianity, decided to share power, decided to go out of his way to allow economic opportunities to as many people as possible in colonial Pennsylvania, right? And so remember the evidence that was offered in defense of that argument. And then revisionist historians, right, look and say, well, I see evidence of a lot of self-interest on behalf of him and his little clique in Philadelphia, and him trying to keep Quaker hegemony or domination over the government for as long as he could. And also, right, remember the write-up included, really arguably focused upon his exploitation of Native Americans, the very group, right, for whom he is praised in court history for being, so accommodating and making sure that everything was by their choice with his annual conventions and following Native American protocol, smoking the peace pipe with the natives, etc. Right? But they also, right, have evidence of them in derogatory fashion, calling him the man with a quill pen, the man who was always pressuring them to sell their lands, almost insatiably. And remember, he was getting pressure from other people, right, who were going to come and offer credit to more people, offer business opportunities for the entire community. but they made a mandate first saying, we want evidence of clearance of that land. We want to know that when we get there, we don't have to contend with Native Americans if we're going to move from Europe and come there. So he had to ensure that, arguably, and try to sell as much land from the natives as possible. But there's evidence that he knew, right, as the Cheyenne and other tribes were increasingly selling their lands, right, the Iroquois, and trying to dominate in short-term advantages like trade, right? There's evidence that he knew that was eventually, in the long run, a losing game for the Native Americans, and he arguably did not lose any sleep over that and continued to sell or to purchase as much land from the Native American tribes as he could. All right. The New England history, court history, right? Like we learned as children, that the Pilgrims in particular of 1620 were idealistic, right? As well as the Puritans, arguably, that they were ahead of their time, that they were progressive, right? And we talked about that with their Protestant religion, wanting individual interpretation of the Bible, widespread literacy, the first public school system with the old Deluder law, et cetera, right? Them being ahead of time at the forefront of scientific investigation with vaccines, even the study of arachnids, et cetera, right? That it was not just confined, their society, their studies to theology. The element of representative democracy relative to other colonies, right? With the New England Town Hall meetings, et cetera. So you have that. And then, of course, revisionist historiography tears into them, right? There's evidence of it being very exclusive and intolerant. We looked at the treatment of strangers, right? Non-church members, the strictness with which they restricted membership into their congregational churches, and thereby citizenship and political rights as well, because of their amalgamation of religious and church leadership, right? We looked at the Salem witch trials as a microcosm of all this, right? We looked at the fact that they lorded power in their foreign diplomacy and had double standards with the Pequot and their war with them, eventually jumping on with the Pilgrims and their fight with Metacom, known as King Philip's War, and the Wampanoag, right? And so you find evidence of that as well in revisionist history of New England. Collectively, remember, that is Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth beneath them, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, okay? And so let's see here. We have evidence of, remember the covenant as part of revisionist historiography, right? The belief, right, like with the Old Testament of the Bible, that if collectively the people of New England sin against God, he is going to punish the entire community. So they had select men to check on households. They had laws that were largely tied to Deuteronomy and the Bible and Leviticus, etc. And so they very much, by today's standards, right, they didn't have John Stuart Mill yet and the idea of classical liberalism. You do your thing, I do mine. They had no problem with infringing on people's individual autonomy. It was about the community at large. So they could be tyrannically involved in the individual's daily life. Okay. Let's see here. The middle colonies we talked about, right? The Dutch, as arguably, some go and you look at the Netherlands themselves. Okay. Don't get me wrong, relative to other European countries, The Hague and the government there, right? They arguably saw the Spaniards as their colonizers as an anti-model. So they become much more tolerant than other European countries. You look at cities like Amsterdam and Leiden, they were very, very tolerant and very diverse, and allowing Jewish and Christian from a myriad of denominations, Protestant and Catholic, to coexist in those cities and have opportunities. Nevertheless, depiction in the argument of handout of the Dutch West India Company, of governors like Stuyvesant, was less tolerant, right? And more pragmatic and wanting to make money. All right. And then let's see here. Then look at Alan Brinkley with his textbook questions on the Tories in Parliament and the navigation laws. Okay, so check those out in your textbook. And then just this is kind of sporadic because it's just things I'm filling in holes here. Uh, the Iroquois arguably utilized their agency in the St. Lawrence River Valley and taking over land from their Huron enemies and posing themselves as the necessary middleman for the fur trade. That, to me, is argumentatively an example of the Iroquois utilizing their agency in the colonial time period. Okay. St. Augustine in Spanish Florida is the longest lasting European established city here in the United States. And the Sacred Expedition, right, was the famous one that was given permission in 1769. And throughout the 1770s, the Spaniards did the whole peaceful colonization project of missions, right? Presidios, which were military forts, pueblos, which were cities, and surrounding haciendas or the hacendados, right? Kind of a four-pronged attack. It was meant to be a peaceful alternative, according to the Bourbon reforms, to declaring, like the requirimiento or something. You have 24 hours to establish, to embrace the Catholic Church and Christian faith, or we declare holy war on you. It would seem to be a peaceful alternative to that, right? But of course, you have the 1775 rebellion in San Diego, and you have evidence of visiting priests and others contending that there was coercive treatment and bodily harm and punishment given to the neophytes on these missions. They could not leave without permission, right? Vallejo was ordered to go and catch them, especially here in the Central Valley of California. That is the runaways. And so, yeah, that's known as a sacred expedition. Okay. And so everything else that we have not covered is a textbook question. So I feel like we've covered everything. So I'm going to put this online as soon as possible. Please finish this test by the due date, okay, by midnight of the due date. Um, and you guys have a great week, okay? Good luck with this. And good luck. Take care. All right. Bye bye.